Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every week, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me, and most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. This episode is part of the California Leadership Series, where we focus on changemakers in California government who are shaping the most innovative energy and climate policy anywhere, transforming the world's fifth largest economy and beyond. Our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series is Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the US and is available to 95% of the US population. Lyft is preferred by drivers and passengers for its reliable and friendly experience and its commitment to effecting positive change for the future of our cities as the first rideshare company to launch a carbon offset program. And now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. This week, we're going to talk about water. Water has always been a critical and highly contentious issue in California. In the southern part of the state, water is imported from the north as well as from neighboring states via the Colorado River, which is itself facing existential challenges. In the north, we depend on snowpack from the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is under severe threat by climate change. The state's massive agricultural activities use most of the available freshwater sources, while the state's swelling population of 35 million, many of whom reside in the megapolises of the LA Basin and the San Francisco Bay Area, sop up the remainders. The state is still reeling from the deep drought of 2012 to 2017, which was hot on the heels of the 2006 to 2010 drought, and climate change threatens to heighten the frequency and severity of future droughts. All of this makes water a highly politicized, thorny, and perennially quarrelsome topic. Who better to lead the state's management of water resources than Felicia Marcus, chair of the state's Water Resources Control Board? Marcus is a gifted consensus maker and bridge builder, and she understands the nuances of California's water conundrum better than anyone. The board she oversees sets statewide policy, settles water rights disagreements, and hears appeals of local regional water quality decisions, and is responsible for both water quality and water rights across the state. Marcus has held high-ranking positions at the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Trust for Public Lands, and was administrator for Region 9, that's the western states, for US EPA under Clinton. I had the chance to talk with Felicia at her offices in Sacramento about her life and career, her advice for folks wanting to make a positive environmental impact with their careers, and I learned a lot about the outlook for this critical resource in California's future. Well, Felicia Marcus, thank you for joining me today on the podcast. I want to start by talking about your beginnings and sort of understand the roots of your interest in service and in the environment.
Well, I've sort of a strangely accidental career. I mean, I've always been interested in trying to make a difference in the world. I don't know why or how or where that came from, but I think I was a dutiful little girl and I believed in the golden rule and I took everything literally, but I just think that's always been something that it was the only thing I thought of wanting to do. I didn't see other paths. It wasn't necessarily in government. It was figuring out how to make a difference in the world. So as a young adult, one of my first jobs after a year abroad after college was to work for a congressman. And I was working frankly, on healthcare and a variety of issues. I wasn't working on environmental issues at the time. In fact, I thought environmental issues were the province of the elite and good luck to them saving their backyards. It wasn't something that actually had captured me at the time other than a bit in, high school. But it wasn't necessarily what I thought of as a career because I have always been very much focused on people. But while I was working on the Hill was the era of Love Canal. And then all of a sudden, the issue of environmental pollution and it being a public health issue and affecting people of all income ranges really captured me. There was a very dynamic elected official on Capitol Hill, Al Gore, who was working on the Superfund law at the time. And I realized that environmental work was something that could capture my head and my heart because it was compelling and became more compelling if I had it captured in relationship to people, but also that it involved complex trade-offs rather than pure right and wrong. And so it could capture my head in terms of the puzzles and the challenge of public policy, but also that's what grabbed me and made it seem more compelling. And so that's why I started pursuing that and going to law school and all that. I think if that hadn't have happened, I probably would have still gone to law school, or I would have gone and done something else, but it might not have been in the environmental arena, because it really gives you this opportunity to solve problems, and it ends up, far from the narrow view I originally had of it. It touches everything in terms of quality of life, and that's why since then I've worked on pollution issues, but also things like water supply, the natural world, but even land conservation and the like, because people need all of that in order to have a healthy future.
It's really interesting that you approach this from and have approached it from the standpoint of people. Obviously, we live in our environment, and we're affected by it. But sometimes there is, I think, a dichotomy in thinking for people that are interested in service. That's okay. Well, we want to save the planet for the planet's sake, and there are good arguments around that. But of course, this is our home too. Before we go farther into the career, though, I want to back up for 1 second because there's something really intriguing to me about what you studied as an undergrad, which was East Asian Studies.
Right.
What compelled you and what interested you in that field of study?
Well, I maybe a little obsessive about issues. I was completely captivated. I knew very little about Asia in particular, and when I hit college in first year, just a survey course of East Asian Studies, I was absolutely fascinated by all things Asia, particularly China, but not exclusively China. It included Japan and other places. But I was totally captivated by a completely different way of looking at the world from civilizations that were far older, and the combination in them of different artistic aesthetic, a different sense of men and women's place in the cosmos and the longer continuum. But I was actually also just fascinated by the politics of everything that had happened, particularly during the Second World War and the Chinese Civil War, and different players who had been involved in that, both as journalists and as foreign service officers, and how policy was made. My whole thesis was about a comparison between two different humans. I realize as I go back even to high school stuff, I've always been interested in the role of individual people in making change in the world, not grand sweeps of history. So my whole thesis was comparing someone who thought in grand sweeps of history and someone who just thought about real people on the ground, and how they ended up in very different places on what was happening in the Chinese Civil War between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, and a host of other players, and then who actually had influence over U.S. foreign policy and why was that. And it had more to do where someone went to high school and what their childhood was like. And so everything about it, from China to the actual foreign policy and how policy is made issue. And again, those complex trade-offs and how they happen just grabbed me and allowed me to immerse in a completely different world than I had known, while still looking at all the same kinds of issues I would have looked at had I been in a standard political science or government curriculum. But it had more color and flavor and other stuff I got to learn along the way. And the price I paid was I had to learn to speak Chinese, or at least take 2 years of it and be able to passably speak it at the time.
Mandarin,
yeah.
And how are your Mandarin chops these days?
They're not great. I'm not terrific at the language. Was another piece of why I was doing something a little different for a while. I was going to go to graduate school, but I also realized the fact that I wasn't a natural linguist was going to mean I really, really had to want to do that. So that's why I had taken a couple of years to work on the Hill on domestic policy. So I speak it well enough to really amuse people's parents and to make people laugh because I sound better than I can hear. But as far as and if I go to China where they speak Mandarin, I can be understood pretty quickly. Actually understanding and translating in my head what I'm hearing, not so much.
Hmm.
So, but I do amuse people. So
So
that has some value.
it's a good way of disarming, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I interrupted you as you started to talk about law school and kind of your reasons for going.
Well, there were a lot of them. I think, especially if you look at environmental work at the time in particular, it's so regulatory. You had the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, and there are 14 federal statutes. So there's so much of the work in the environment that was a legal regulatory framework that going to law school as a tool, I didn't want to be a lawyer necessarily.
Mm.
I had reasons why it would be nice to have a saleable skill in case all of it didn't work out. But I took it as much as an advanced civics kind of an education, which it surely is, as a way to just have another powerful tool to be an activist, which is really more what I thought I would go off and do. And I've done a mix of the two of them. I actually working as a general private sector lawyer was also very educational in terms of thinking through learning how to be very specific and parse things and figure out how to come to agreements that are in one's client's interests are just as valuable in the activist public interest world as they are in the private sector. And my brief private sector experience gave me a lot of tools and experience to figure out how to hone those skills and how to engage with people who didn't
Hmm.
already agree.
And where did that fall sequentially, your private practice?
It was, well, I graduated law school. I clerked for a federal judge who really did help teach me how to write. He was really a phenomenal writer and how to do more than 2 drafts of a document. It gets a lot better when you do 10 drafts of something. It took me until after law school to actually learn that. And then I had a fellowship at the Center for Law and the Public Interest, which was a great place to go because it did environmental work, but it also did social justice work. And I've always been interested in both and the intersection of people and the environment, not just protecting the planet for abstract reasons, which actually does also have value to people and who we are as a species. But my personal engagement has been much more focused on how things are affecting people. That's just what motivates me more. Perhaps I'm less intellectual and more of a gut motivated person. And at the end of the fellowship, I was looking for a public interest job, and they're hard to find.
Mm.
And instead, I found a law firm. So it was fairly shortly, just a few years out of law school, I found a law firm that was known for allowing a lot of pro bono. In
Mm.
fact, as much as you wanted. I probably had the best caseload of any young lawyer in America because I could do as much pro bono work as I wanted, and they had a lot of partners who were doing pro bono work for Planned Parenthood, for the ACLU, for different organizations, and I got to be the associate on their
Mm.
pro bono cases. I brought in my own case, which was representing Heal the Bay and the California Environmental Trust in litigation against the city of LA to try and clean up Santa Monica Bay, and they actually helped pay all my costs and sort of created a home for that case, which I wanted to continue on after I had left the Center for Law and the Public Interest. And frankly, I probably would have gone to be an environmental prosecutor, but it would have conflicted with my sewage case. So I found a home for the sewage case, thinking eventually I might get back to something else, and then had a good experience there doing a whole range of litigation, right, a lot pro bono, but some of my paying clients were the Philippine Commission on Good Government in the RICO case against Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. I
Mm.
was the junior lawyer on that team,
Wow.
but that was really cool. And a really big mortgage equity fraud case where we represented Bank of America in going after the people who had defrauded all of their customers. And then I actually had some general, commercial litigation as well, where I learned how to be a better lawyer than I might have if I was just doing one kind of case or one. So it's opportunity to be well-rounded while also doing good. And then eventually I went off and got another public interest job at public counsel. And after that, I ended up going into a series of government jobs and then nonprofit jobs that weren't lawyer jobs. I've been a client a lot longer than I was a practicing
Right.
lawyer.
And one of those early jobs, as I understand it, was with the LA Department of Public Works.
Yeah, which was a very odd thing at the time. I mean, that was sort of an odd, at the time I called it, it was like a Václav Havel sort of a thing for, I may be dating myself with that, but it was odd to have someone who had been the lawyer for Heal the Bay be recruited to be a commissioner and ultimately the president of the Board of Public Works running the sewer system that I had been suing, but also helping them make the transition to a grand recycling program and water recycling. And it basically was an era at which Mayor Tom Bradley was trying to do legacy work that he hadn't done quite as much of in his first 16 years as mayor, and pretty much gave me the car keys and said, "Kid, get it as clean as you can." I mean,
That's
it
incredible.
was absolutely amazing, and that I credit his chief deputy mayor, both deputy mayors at the time, Mark Fabiani and Mike Gage was the chief deputy who came up with the idea and talked me into it, which I said no the first time they asked me because I thought it was like a bridge too far and it was too early in their turnaround. And then they just were following through. And by the time I did it, it wasn't that weird because Heal the Bay and the city had developed a partnership of trying to upgrade the wastewater program, and they went far beyond what we could have ever made them do just in court, which is when we really trusted them. And then it did make sense to go in and put myself where my mouth is. And it was the first of about 5 times when I've ended up in a job where I used to say what someone in that job ought to do, including this one. So,
What's interesting about it is that when one thinks about, I'm doing a lot of work right now in mapping the landscape of sustainability jobs.
mm-hmm,
And, there are the pure plays,
mm-hmm,
going to work for a clean tech company or a renewable energy developer. But some of the highest leverage work that you can do is working for big polluters, working for incumbent institutions that really need to transition, really need to clean up. So, but this was just public works. Was this before power was attached to it, or is
no,
is
it's still separate.
It is. Okay.
It was public works was street maintenance. We did a lot of contracting for other agencies, wastewater program, garbage collection, and those sorts of things. A lot of the small boutique offices were put there because you had a 5-member board who could sort of shepherd them through.
Mm.
We had graffiti abatement and a small business hazardous waste minimization program, and we had the reclamation water recycling office that was set up to get the Department of Water and Power and the wastewater program to work together to figure out how not to just treat water to a certain level and dump it in the ocean or in a storm drain, but figure out how to get it into groundwater basins or reuse on, at the time, golf courses, cemeteries, and industrial uses. And that work, which was, I don't know, 25 or so years ago now, is finally really bearing fruit. So now we're at this, it's funny how this keeps happening to me. So now here we are at the state board and we're having to make decisions about whether people can take water out of streams to recycle because the urge to recycle is so great, but you can't dewater streams. Right. Either you actually have to get a water rights permit to be able to take that water out, and we have to think about, okay, what needs to stay in this particular water body in order to maintain fish and wildlife habitat or the like, which is a great problem to have. 25 years ago, I said I'd be happy when I had that problem, or when we as a society had that problem, because it would mean that recycling had finally taken off, and here we are, so I can't complain about that problem.
Well, that's a lot of progress. So what was your first role in the nonprofit or NGO realm? Was this Trust for Public Lands?
My first role was as a fellow at the Center for Law and the Public Interest, right after my clerkship. And then after working at the law firm, it was being the director of litigation of public counsel. After that, I went to the city of LA, and then I went to US EPA and the Clinton administration. And then I spent 10 years at the leadership level in a couple of national nonprofits. One was the Trust for Public Land, where I was the executive vice president and COO. And quite frankly, I did that for 7 years, and it was phenomenal because you just saw these miracles happening, a couple hundred or more of these projects happening all across the country where people had risen across traditional divides to make a real project happen on the ground, to get the funding, to get the land, to get the vision, to get the design, to get the construction and all of that done, to really make either a neighborhood or a working lands conservation easement work, or a recreational opportunity in a park that was going to be in the National Park Service or BLM or wherever it was. We were going to be connecting people and land and using the tools of bringing people together across traditional divides. So it was just a phenomenal package. And frankly, I left the water world specifically to want to go work with people who knew how to make a deal with people who didn't already agree with them, because that is a challenge in the water world. I feel like in the water world, I've been more of a social worker than anything else. And I don't know why it's so hard in the water world, but it seems like it is. And that was really a balm to my soul. And then I went to the Natural Resources Defense Council for a few years as the Western director, which got me back into the policy arena writ large. But it was really nice to spend the 7 years in land conservation where you actually do a thing and it kind of stays done and you can see it.
What was the experience, just backing up a minute, because I got the sequencing slightly wrong. What was the experience of running Region 9 in President Clinton's EPA?
Well,
what were some of the highlights, lowlights? What was the dynamic like?
Well, EPA was it was exhausting, but it was a phenomenal experience because it was an administration that wanted to do, and wanted to do it with people. I mean, we were really big on stakeholder engagement and solutions that ended up honoring people across traditional divides. So the people who were hired, at least at EPA, we were all people who had a track record of being able to work with business, folks in agriculture, folks in the environmental community, people in government, people outside of government. And so our job was to bring people together to try and make the agency more responsive to all the different communities that we served. And we were doing all kinds of place-based work and all the rest. So for me, it was a tremendous opportunity to be able to open the doors and windows, so to speak, metaphorically, between these incredibly smart folks who were really smart and who wrote regulations, and introduce them to the real people, whether in ag or industry, who were actually trying to do a thing and trying to comply, or with folks in the environmental and environmental justice communities. It was also great to be able to work with 143 federally recognized tribes as a federal official, and to actually make good on government-to-government relationships and our trust responsibilities, and to help build tribal environmental capacity the way EPA had been doing it with the states for 30 years. We were also supposed to be doing it, at least for the last 10 or 15 years before I got there, with tribes, but folks had been afraid to start or didn't have the funding. And so for me, one of the greatest things I got to do was to help build tribal environmental capacity to manage their own environmental futures, and it was incredible. But we also worked with the Department of Defense to build their environmental programs, and we worked with municipalities, and we worked with the private sector on pollution prevention and other business-friendly partnerships to figure out, could you find a better way to achieve an environmental result at less cost? And we did a series of initiatives on that. And the whole thrust of that administration was actually to try and work with people, even as from the federal government, to make something positive happen, either across an industry or on the ground. It was a phenomenal opportunity.
Was climate change on people's minds yet?
It was at some point during that, because of course we had Al Gore as the vice president, and so it was, and we did, we were always going out and doing, the feds have a reputation for staying behind closed doors and issuing decrees from offices in Washington or wherever they're regional. We were out there working with people and directed to by the administration. I did a whole round of hearings on climate change around the Southwest, including in Arizona and other places where folks were somewhat hostile to the idea at the time. But we were starting a conversation. We weren't issuing decrees, and we were looking for those win-win opportunities, whether it had to do with tree planting or thinking about more, it was sort of the beginning of conversations about sustainability as well. And we did a whole initiative on smart growth. That was a whole nother wave of hearings we have, but we also did them on things like early childhood development and the like. I mean, there's a whole range of things the administration did to try and figure out how to elevate conversations about how to make a better world with people on the ground. So it was great. So climate was definitely there. I had a couple of people with energy experience. I would have liked to have been able to engage in it even more, but we were avid watchers of what was happening in California and other states. But we had plenty of work to do, sticking to our knitting.
Yeah. Okay. So now, fast forwarding a bit, maybe just touching again on NRDC, which is when I first met you in your role as Western States director.
Yeah, it was the Western U.S. director, right? It was sort of a weird thing because I was a national. It wasn't like everybody in the West reported to me. I was in the national leadership team located in the Western United States, so we could extend our reach and our sense of being one institution. So I was pretty much a utility player on a lot of things and helped run, the National Policy Committee and all of that. So NRDC is a really interesting organization that doesn't have a strict hierarchical structure. So in some ways, I was a bit of a camp counselor trying to tie the really brilliant pieces of it together.
But in terms of policy, it was a cross-cutting role.
Yes, it was definitely a cross-cutting role. Yes.
And talk about your transition to Sacramento and the water board.
Well, that one's been it's interesting. As much as I said, I tried to get away from water for a while. I always say it was kind of hard to continue to be the princess of peace when you're pissed. I was just a little tired of having to explain to people how they needed to see the valid points of view of people on the other side to achieve resolution and move policy versus just spouting their talking points across the transom for 30 years. And so figuring out
why is water such a contentious, divisive issue?
Honestly, I don't know. I think there's a part of it that's just very fragmented. I think there's a part of it where it's just very complicated. I think it's something everybody thinks they can relate to. So you have more people engaging in it. I think it's an arena where because it is complex and has so many dimensions, people can focus on a narrow piece of it and get to know that narrow piece really well, but not really understand how it interacts. I mean, we're a very big state, so you can have your own talking circle of people who agree that can feel kind of big, agree with each other and assume that everybody else is either stupid or vile, which it happens in every element of the stakeholder group, where they'll say, well, if we just did this one thing, why don't those, expletive bleeping either bureaucrats or other stakeholders, if they just did this one thing, it would solve the whole problem. And the fact is it won't. So I'm fond of putting an elephant up on the screen everywhere I go and talking about the parable of the blind man and the elephant, where they're touching this amazing creature and they're describing what they're touching and feeling very well, but there's no way you can see how it all comes together. Whereas, in fact, you really have to step back and look at how it comes together. And if you do that, you realize there's not just one answer. There are a lot of answers, which is why I've liked being a part of this administration, which has embraced the California Water Action Plan, which, that may sound like a slogan, but it's actually been very effective in putting everything on deck to say we're arguing past each other on one piece of the puzzle while we have climate change bearing down on us, which I've called a freight train of pain. And the governor's come up with far more eloquence to talk about it, where we're going to lose half or more or all of our snowpack before too long, because just a few degrees of temperature rise and more of it falls as rain rather than snow, to be overly simplistic. But our snowpack is fully a third of our storage in an average year. And we need storage because it doesn't fall the same every year. It doesn't fall where it's most used. It doesn't fall in the time of year it's used. And so you have to figure out how to deal with. But if we lose a third more, all the little things we've been arguing about here are going to seem like a picnic. And so rather than picking one or two, we just said, look, we've got to do all of these if we have a shot at dealing with that terrible tsunami of nightmare that's coming at us. But we can do it if we do it and get off our butts and do it, which is conservation, recycling, stormwater capture, integrated water management of all kinds, which fits in with sustainability, thinking about what that drop of water does from the top of the watershed on down and getting what my friend Ellen Hannock calls more pop for drop all the way down. It's the same thing someone does as a sustainability director in a private enterprise or in a municipality or anywhere. We need to do that societally. And because we're so really wasteful with water, if we do that, we can actually deal with what's coming at us. But if we just keep talking past each other, we're not. And so when I went to NRDC, I got pulled into some of the water fights around the Delta Reform Act to help mediate between the parties, and we were ultimately successful with that. And so I got put on the Delta Stewardship Council, which was created out of that as a part-time thing. So then when this administration came in to oversimplify a longer story, it made sense to pull me into this job, since I get along with people on all sides, because it's not about whether agriculture is good and bad, the environment is good or bad, urban water users are good or bad, or industry are good or bad. The task is figuring out, how do we more intelligently manage this precious resource that's essential for our lives and the lives of the fish and wildlife that we care about too. How we take care of the ecosystem means a lot to who we are as a people. It could be, there is a test out there, it could be the test of our time, but it's not as simple as maybe waving a magic wand or saying yes or no. It gets back to those complex resource trade-offs. So,
a special thanks to our sustainable business sponsor for the California Leadership Series, Lyft. Lyft is the fastest growing rideshare company in the US and is available to 95% of the US population. Now, all Lyft rides are carbon neutral. This means that a decision to ride with Lyft is a decision to take a cleaner option, cleaner than driving yourself or riding with another company, and will fund efforts that are reducing emissions and combating climate change. This is a multi-million-dollar investment in the first year alone, which makes Lyft one of the top voluntary purchasers of carbon offsets in the world. In year one, Lyft anticipates offsetting over 1 million tons of carbon, equivalent to planting tens of millions of trees or taking hundreds of thousands of cars off the road. Lyft's investment and impact will continue to grow as the company does. Ride Lyft and join together in effecting positive change for the future of our cities. To learn more, visit lyft.com/carbon. So I want to just switch gears for 1 second and talk about the opportunities that the water sector has in particular for people that are interested in doing this kind of work, right? You've pointed out some of the challenges that we're facing, the freight train of pain that's bearing down on us. But this also means that there's a lot of work to be done. So what kind of work do you see as being kind of the most interesting, the largest opportunities in the water sector, specifically geared towards people that are just starting out and really have the passion to do something about environmental sustainability?
It's a great question. I think there's a lot. There's so many more opportunities than there were when I was starting out. You had to kind of invent your own opportunities, and I think there's a whole nother field of being able to do this coming out of the sciences or law or business in the private sector, et cetera. I mean, they're just environmental issues have become more mainstream, even though there's a lot of work to be done. And so there's a much bigger menu of opportunity. I think for young people starting out, and I always give this advice probably based on my accidental career where I kept changing jobs. I didn't ever want to leave a job, but some either ended because it was a political job or someone said, you really ought to do this, and people have kicked my butt into another job. I mean, I'm lucky to have enough people around me who have said you should do this, and I almost always say no at first, and then people explain to me, because I always love what I'm doing, have explained to me why there's an opportunity to do something else that might make a difference. But the fact that I've moved around, I think, has made me much more effective in terms of each job I've gone into subsequently, because I know there's not just one universe or not just one talking circle, and each experience that you have gives you another insight into the fact that things don't have to be the way they are. They can be another way, and there are tools you can bring from energy, you can bring from a completely different career. I haven't figured out what I brought from my Asian studies background, but I am sure it's there in my openness to new ideas and not accepting a rigid way of thinking of how the universe operates. But I think when I'm giving young people advice, I have sort of a range of things that I suggest. And I think it's important to try and figure out how to spend some time in government, also in the NGO sector if you find the right place to go, but also in the private sector if you can find a place to go, and not just wear that suit and become that job, but to learn what you can and try and do good within that job, particularly in making connections and keeping your eyes open to what's happening in other places. I mean, I spent a good part of yesterday or day before yesterday in Santa Monica at an all-day climate festival they had, which had speakers like me talking about issues ranging from renewables to water to climate science, but also had people talking about transportation issues and all kinds of things, as well as people taking classes on what they could do in their own life. And there were a lot of young people there who were working in local sustainability offices or water agencies who every day were actually coming up with the projects and doing projects on the ground, working with community people to make a park happen, to create a stormwater capture swale, to figure out how to make Santa Monica more self-sustaining, how to do your landscaping in the city so that you would end up creating opportunities for wildlife and wildlife corridor. So I actually think whether you're in Culver City or Santa Monica or Santa Clara, Cupertino, or pick any arena, going into local government is something that I think has real value. Going into the private sector, if you can, has real value. And working with an NGO has real value. But I think a consciousness of thinking about how you can move around to construct a career and a life that gives you the perspective that doesn't keep you wedded to a party line anywhere, but just gives you that freedom to figure out how to try and make the best difference you can anywhere you are, can lead to opportunity. At least it has for me. And I started out as thinking I had to sue government all the time to get anything done. And I think I've gotten a lot more done by actually being willing to go into government and make hard decisions than I ever could have just trying to force somebody to do something with a lawsuit. So I always say, my karma overcame my dogma, which was a button people used to wear in the 60s, and that's only possible because I've had the opportunity to sit in other people's chairs. But you can construct a life that has you doing that as well and consciously thinking in a job, am I having the greatest impact? Does this suit my skills? Because there can be the idea of a job, and then there's the job of the job. What's the stuff you get to learn? Who are the people you get to work with? And I think working with people that you respect is probably the best, and overwhelmingly guiding force. And if you're interested in sustainability, you're going to find the people who walk the talk.
Is there, in that vein, is there someone that you can point to that really inspired you along the way?
Well, I've been lucky because folks have taken me under their wing along the way. I think Kathleen Brown is someone who had a tremendous influence on me as a powerful woman who told me I should take her seat on the Board of Public Works when she left. And, I never thought of myself as someone in a job like that. I thought of myself as someone who would argue with government, make a case, or sue. And she, really made the case. Mike gauged it as well, but she really made the two of them really thought outside the box and said, you can do this and we need to bring your sensibility in, but you'll learn a lot too and be able to, this is a vehicle for you making the difference in the world that you want to make. And so they'll help me overcome my natural resistance to the idea of being in a job where I was actually the decision maker rather than trying to influence a decision maker. Because I have to say, it is a lot harder to be a decision maker than to just try to tell somebody else to make somebody else do something. You grow up a lot. I think I grew up 40 years in the 4 years I was at Public Works. It was hard. And I grew an incredibly healthy respect for the public servants that did that hard work all day, that I got a lot more credit than they did because I was out in the public doing public speaking. Those guys that ran the sanitation department or the guys in engineering, or they were amazing. They got no credit from anybody. They didn't get paid enough. They got beaten up by politicians, and they came to work every day because they knew it was the right thing to do. And they really were the most amazing people I've ever worked with.
I read recently that the word opus, which we think of as meaning some grand piece.
Yeah, right.
Is that the derivation is actually sort of the day-to-day work.
I
It's
know
it's
that.
it's 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 more of a métier than it is a grand expression,
Huh,
and that's kind of stuck with me
it's
in
fabulous.
terms of the nobility of doing the work every day, step by step. So here in your role at the State Water Resources Control Board, can you talk a little bit about that agency itself, types of jobs it employs, what the top priorities for the agency are?
Well, certainly it is unique in the 50 states in that it is a combination of things that are separate in other states. It's a combination of the old water rights board that implements the water rights system for the state of California, which we'd need a whole hour for me to even explain basically, but classic Western, first in time, first in right, but with a overlay of being able to hold water back for public trust or prevent waste and unreasonable use. Very interesting just on the water rights arena, but it was merged 50 years ago. We've been celebrating the birthday with the Water Quality Board because the folks who envisioned that in the legislature felt that you really needed people making these decisions on water rights who also knew what it was like to try and provide clean and safe water and figuring out how to protect fish and wildlife. We also now have the drinking water program, speaking of clean and safe water, which the
Right.
legislature just gave us in 2014. So you would actually have the same agency responsible source to tap. So we're responsible for setting limits on pollutants going into groundwater, on pollutants going into surface waters, but we weren't responsible for what eventually made it out the tap that might have been contaminated along the way. So now we are. So we merged that, and then we also have a large financial funding for all of those things division, and we got emergency powers during the drought to deal with urban conservation regulations, and now under legislation passed just last week, we now that I anticipate the governor will sign because he proposed it originally. We'll have longer term authority to set efficiency standards on water use for all the large urban agencies in the state. So we're sort of I won't call it a hodgepodge, but we have multiple lines of priority. And our top priority is really figuring out how to get money safely out the door. It's a big part of our task,
Hmm.
not just bond monies, but state revolving fund loan monies, which, I'll give you an example. We got out over $1 billion in grants and loans to goose recycling projects from the drawing board to into construction during the big drought that we just went through. We have a role in the new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's more as a backstop cop role, but it's also trying to help folks as they do the really hard work of coming up with sustainable groundwater management plans around the state, even though we're the cop they get to blame for having to do these
Right.
hard things at a local level. And so we have this whole range of things that we work on, even within our water quality and water rights arena. We're updating our standards for the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, which involves many things, but it involves saying how much of water under public trust has to stay in the rivers versus being able to be diverted. It's probably the hottest and toughest issue we have in our water rights adjudicatory function. We're considering the water rights permit change for the tunnels project, which I can't talk about because in that case I'm acting as a judge and I
Mm.
can't listen to anybody or say what I think except in open session. And so if you're looking at something like the State Water Board, you have a menu of things you can do. We have scientists, we have lawyers, we have good public policy advocates, we've got, geologists and geographers and a whole host of things. So there are a
What is the
zillion.
total staff size?
I think the total staff size is somewhere north of 2,000. It's not that big, and that includes the regional
Sizable.
boards.
Mhm.
Our water quality permitting function is done on a watershed basis. And so we've got 9 regional boards that are organized around watersheds in the state because they're setting rules that deal with regional differences and the like. There are other things that are done directly at the state board, like the Safe Drinking Water Program. Even though we have district offices, that's managed here. The Water Rights Program is managed here. The financing unit is managed here because you have an economy of scale where it makes sense and where regional differences don't come into play as much in terms of what comes out the tap. but what you need to send down a particular water course does vary from place to place. And so we have a different organizational structure depending upon which aspect of our work there is, but locationally you can work in quite a few locations throughout the state of California, and you can move around. So you can work on issues at the Mexican border, or at the Oregon border, or at the Nevada border. You can deal on surface water flows and fish and wildlife, or you can work on, how many pollutants should be in a glass of water or shouldn't be in a glass of water, that kind of thing. Or you can work on the technology that it takes to remediate a polluted groundwater site. So there's actually a lot going on every day. I think for us, it's trying to implement everything along the Water Action Plan because we have such a broad sweep. During the drought, we were very much all hands on deck, and most people heard about our urban conservation rules where we were getting to 25% across urban California, but that we calibrated that based on how efficient people already were. So you had, targets ranging from 8 to 36%, depending on how much water you used. And that was in the media an awful lot, but we do a lot more than that.
As I've been talking with some of your colleagues who are focused on climate, an issue that has really taken shape over the last few years is set of issues around equity and environmental justice. And as you mentioned, that was sort of your first part of your awakening,
right?
To realize that the environment wasn't just something for rich people's backyards, but indeed
or bugs and bunnies,
right?
Which is not to disparage bugs and bunnies. They're very important.
We like bunnies. Bugs, depending on which one you're talking about. But can you talk about, in the state of California, there are real equity issues when it comes to water as well. And has that been a theme over the years consistently when your work has touched water, or has that emerged more to the fore in recent years?
Well, it depends on where one's working. I mean, certainly when I was at EPA and we were working on cleaning up Superfund sites, and a lot of that was about water, that was the most important thing. And it certainly was important in LA, where I was involved in the EJ movement as a lawyer, but then also as developed a siting equity program, so that when we rolled out our recycling program, we rolled it out to South Central and East LA first, because South Central and East LA wanted recycling programs, but they had all the facilities. So we made the West Side wait till last. That was sort of cool. Even though I lived on the West Side, it was the right thing to do. And it was like trying to really think about how can you be fair about that sort of thing. I think it's become a very big issue in this job as the human right to water was passed by the legislature in 2012. Didn't have teeth in it, but it was an important first step to tell all of the agencies, hey, this is really important, and we have to figure out how to make access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water important for all Californians. And what's come out of that, at least in our case, is a very good relationship with the disadvantaged community, EJ community, that's been working on water equity issues around drinking water. And they're really the best activists I've seen in many, many years in terms of coming in and sitting down, letting folks from the community speak for themselves, which is the most powerful thing, rather than other folks advocating for those people over there. It's empowering people to speak on their own behalf, which is at the core, I think, of good environmental justice work. And they've sat down with our folks to say, we want to get this done. What does it take to get it done? And then they've worked with us to have a much more sophisticated argument than many environmental groups can have on issues, and gone to the legislature to advocate for the tools we need to actually do the job. And over the course of the last few years, we've made more progress than in the last few decades in terms of moving the drinking water program to us. So you had that source to tap consciousness, but you also had one-stop shopping for small communities to get their financing and technical assistance for both wastewater, which we were pretty good at, but then adding drinking water as a whole, so they're not going to two different agencies. They've gotten us the authority to, with great support of the administration and then ultimately votes of the legislature, to be able to consolidate small drinking water agencies with larger ones who have an economy of scale. I mean, we have thousands of drinking water agencies in California, which makes it virtually impossible to get the economy of scale you need to treat to safe drinking water standards for things like Chrome 6, arsenic, nitrate contamination, let alone contaminants like 1,2,3 TCP that aren't naturally occurring. But to do that, you've got to be able to have the right size, and you need to have the managerial, technical, and financial capacity to run treatment plants and to even accept the kind of grant and loan funding we can give. And so we've made a lot of progress there. And during the drought, where you had people not only drinking inadequately treated water, sometimes out of their own domestic drinking water wells, which we don't regulate, or small communities that we don't regulate, we got legislation that enabled us to work with our partners in the Department of Water Resources and the Office of Emergency Services to actually connect East Porterville up with Porterville and work with Tulare County to give the money and the engineering and the technical to hook up folks who had been drinking contaminated water out of their domestic wells for many, many years. And so now you have nearly a whole community that's now plumbed up to and receiving water from modern treatment plants that meet standards. I mean, that was incredibly exciting and only happened because you had environmental justice community members working with folks in our agencies, folks in the governor's office, folks in the legislature, folks in Tulare County, folks in Porterville. It was a kind of a grand effort that took a while, but it's pretty incredible. And so I think those activists, I am eternally grateful to them for how incredibly effective they have been at keeping this issue front and center and continuing to try to get the next tool. Right now, we have legislation pending. We don't know if it'll pass this year or not. I certainly hope so, which is one of the key missing pieces, which is to make a decision as Californians that we're going to cross-subsidize a little bit the operations and maintenance in these poor communities, because there are communities that I could have grant dollars and build them a treatment plant, but they couldn't afford to even maintain them because their means are so limited, where with just a little cross subsidy from the rest of us, a dollar a month per household, some money kicked in on a fee on fertilizer, because nitrogen fertilizer has left a legacy contaminant role, and we have the support of many in agriculture for that, and dairies. You come up with a chunk of money we can use that can make that difference between being able to provide drinking water or not. So I'm hoping we'll get that passed this year, because if it takes another year, that's another year that there are communities I can't help. Sorry, I went on and on, but that is probably the issue of our time as well. One is how we as a society deal with climate change and the myriad things we have to do, not the one thing, but the myriad things we have to do in changing our lifestyles, but also changing how we do business and how we manage government agencies and how we do it all in a more integrated way. But along with that, it's how are we going to deal with getting clean, safe, and affordable drinking water to all Californians? And it's not that big of a lift, but it requires a decision that we're actually going to do it. And if we don't decide to do it, we'll never get there.
Yeah. How many people are don't have access to clean drinking
Well,
water?
we don't know for sure. Hundreds of thousands that we know of. There are about maybe 330 small communities that serve over 25 people. So we do have a regulatory authority over them. So we have much better numbers. It could be anywhere. It could be close to 1 million. We don't know. And one of the things we would do right at the beginning of getting these new authorities and the new dollars would be to go out there and figure out how to serve them. It's much harder to figure out how to get safe drinking water to everyone on a domestic well, because you're not going to say we're going to subsidize people who move away from people they're really far. And that's why we prioritize things like East Porterville, where you just have a community that's like a rectangle cut out of another community who are on their own. That's where it makes total sense to hook them up and get an economy of scale. But even just dealing with those, we have hundreds of thousands. We've been able to help thousands since we've gotten those tools I was talking about, but we have many more to get
But
to.
having the mandate will
Yeah, hundreds of thousands. I mean, again, in a state like California, I would think our numbers are probably better than anywhere else, but that's still not good enough. Well over 98, 99% of Californians are getting clean, safe, and affordable drinking water out their taps. They may not know where it comes from, but they're getting it. It's that other small remaining fraction that we've got to get to and figure out how to help get them drinking, at least drinking water, not lush lawns, drinking water.
Yes.
And sanitation.
None of us need lush lawns.
None of us really do need lush lawns.
So in looking back at the work here at the board and across your really diverse career, what had been, or maybe what has been the biggest challenge or setback, and kind of the flip side of that, what are you most proud of and what you've done?
It's a good question. I think, hmm, I think there are plenty of setbacks that have to do with how much longer it takes to get anything done than we might have thought. So on the one hand, I could say the Bay Delta Accord of the 90s that I was pleased to be a part of, and the multiple accords that have come since. It's hard not to be really proud of that. I'm probably more proud of the work, most proud of the work I did with tribes, because it's hard to express what it feels like to help sort of make good on 150 years of broken promises and be able to come back in and actually create respectful relationships and help tribes grow capacity to manage their own affairs. I think when I went into that job, I had no idea how many tribes were still here because I was an urban California girl, from LA. And it was just incredible to watch us be able sometimes to even give a tribe their first full-time environmental professional who then, later became a tribal council member or tribal chair. I mean, it's just this wave of empowerment that happened is it's hard to beat. Porterville felt pretty good, although I just got to say yes. I wasn't as much involved in all of those negotiations. I think the setbacks come from the fact that you think you've made progress and you haven't made as much as needs to be done. I do believe in the art of the possible, but if I go back and I think about the Bay Delta Accord and those other issues, here I am 20 years later, where what we had agreed to wasn't good enough to protect the species, and we have winter run and other runs of salmon on the brink of collapse when we thought we were actually doing something that would have greater legs. And so the only thing to do is just keep at it. I think the drought as well really had highs and lows. I mean, it called on everybody to call on the better angels of their natures. And I think we accelerated this more modern thinking about water in the state, again, by decades compared to what came before. And we're able to punch through the normal noise and call on Californians to think as Californians. And they rose to the occasion in the way regular people do, if you actually can get to regular people in one of these jobs. And the drought allowed us and a whole great team of people to be able to do that, but it also postponed the time. So we're a little bit late. We made some judgment calls that were harder on fish and wildlife in the heat of those challenging decisions, where I think what I'm most disappointed on is that we haven't made good on that promise of reconciling human and ecological uses, and the fact that humans are a part of the ecosystem around the Bay Delta suite of issues. I still have hopes that we'll get some things across the transom, and I have hopes for voluntary agreements, but I'm not naive enough to think that we don't also need to update our regulations to create a backstop and an opportunity to do it. And the way I deal with those disappointments is just to try and get some sleep and then come right back to it. I tend to be a little bit like one of those punching things that comes right back up. Sometimes I look for the opportunities in defeat to get something else done, and that's how I cope with it.
I think you have to. We were just talking with Matt Rodriguez an hour ago,
great.
And he gave a sense of the long view, and that the environmental fight is a long fight, and there are battles along the way. I think that for those starting out in the field, there's a tremendous sense of urgency, and there is, and that's a real thing. But that's also within the context of a multi-decadal work that needs to be done.
No, I think it's true. I mean, we've had some tremendous victories, and you have to sort of choose them based on where those opportunities are. I mean, if you look at the public sentiment for recycling back 30 years ago, it's interesting that you had this public sentiment for recycling bottles, cans, and everything, which is because I think people want to make a difference in the world, and they just get that waste is bad. And here we are 30 years later, finally getting water conservation in some sort of, I mean, it's 30 years later that we actually finally have a framework for water conservation at a state level, or groundwater management just in the last few years. I mean, water has lagged, where I think the public sentiment is about what we ought to be doing as a society in general. It's an interest. I couldn't tell you why that is, but it definitely is.
So just to take one pause, I want to just ask a clarifying point before I ask the sort of last two questions. Do you term out when the governor terms out, or do you have a a term
I
that?
have a 4-year term and I can be reappointed. I happen to be in the one of the 5 seats. I'm in the attorney seat, which is up right as a new governor comes in.
Okay.
So I don't leave the moment Jerry Brown leaves. My term is up January 15th, and then I can serve until March 15th. If I'm not reappointed before March 15th, then I'm out and I can't be reappointed for a year. So it's a little complicated. I mean, it's always the time between January and March for a state board member, and I think it's 2 other months for regional board members, excuse me, are always kind of a busy time in the governor's appointments office. So I could be reappointed by the next governor or not. Nothing personal. I just don't know.
Okay. So I'll use that information just
Yeah.
to sort of frame this. So we're now in the last year of the Brown administration, and what are sort of the remaining top priorities in your minds that you want to accomplish this year, and that the governor seeks to accomplish?
Well, there are so many, and some of them aren't just with the state board, they're in concert with other agencies. And it has to do with the things that are in that 10-point water action plan. I mean, the goal of the plan was a 5-year plan to lay a foundation for a sustainable water future, not to get it all done because it's a longer lap, but to move the baton down the field and even set the field. I mean, we may still even be in the starting blocks, but at least we're on the right track. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that. So I would think at the top of the list, one of them was getting the efficiency legislation passed that passed last week. So Yahoo on
That's great.
that. Another is safe drinking water, which is getting a funding source to deal with that big missing piece that allows us to get to the biggest chunk of the greatest number, the greatest accomplishment we could in a short period of time on getting safe drinking water to people. I think on the Bay Delta, it's updating the water quality control plan, hopefully with voluntary settlements that get folks in to agree to do win-wins for floodplains and habitat restoration and managing water for fish as well as flood control, etc. But that requires people deciding they want to do it. So for us, it's finishing the water quality control plans, hopefully with voluntary settlements baked in, but if not, with an opening for people to come in later. That framework is probably the most important regulatory thing on our plate. It's implementing getting the cannabis regulations for water supply and water quality settled, brand new program, incredibly important, an issue that has already had a devastating impact when it was in the shadows on illegal water diversions and dumping illegal pesticides in. I mean, it's one of these things where you have people in agriculture looking at the rules they have to follow and seeing that industry not, but we're trying to bring people out into the sunshine to comply. Won't be done, but a big thing to set in motion that's a very high on our agenda. Unfortunately, the governor and the legislature have given us staff to do enforcement and the like, but that is a huge issue to try and get further along before we, turn the lights out, so to speak, or hand the keys over to the next administration. I think continuing our push and find some of those win-win solutions in local areas that can make a difference. Bay Delta is one example, but there's a lot of integrated water management planning happening everywhere, whether it's work on stormwater capture in Los Angeles. We've done a lot that we said we were going to do to update standards for recycled water. So you have uniform public health protective standards for use outdoors. We did that in 2014. Indirect potable reuse, surface water augmentation we did last year. And we're working right now on a framework for how we're going to get to direct potable reuse regulations. That's been big. There's probably more. I think I have a long list of them. I think those are, now that we're getting towards the finish, safe drinking water and Bay Delta standards are definitely at the top of the list. There are a lot of the deadlines we've been successful on. So on groundwater, the next deadline is in 2020. So it's preparing for that one. But for the next 6 months, those are the Bay Delta things, and the Bay Delta and safe drinking water are the 2 top ones.
So I want to end with a two-part question. Coming back to the early part of your career and the importance that you placed on people, and that, interestingly, driving your environmental work. Has the motivation has the driver changed for you in any way? Why are you doing the work now?
That is so interesting. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I am sort of the social worker more than anything in the environmental world, and I've always just seen the people, and that obviously people have thought it was useful because I keep being brought into situations and jobs. Sometimes I feel like the Forrest Gump of the environmental community because I just keep showing up different places, but there's an intangible to that. And I think I'm doing the exact same things I saw when I was in high school in everything I got into. And every time I unearth something and cleaning out a box and see something I wrote, I thought, oh my God, I'm seeing the exact same thing that I've always been seeing, which I don't think is that I don't think it's that my thinking has evolved. It's just that I've been given opportunities to actually actualize and put into practice some of the things that I see. And I like to say that the biggest challenge we have in making environmental progress sometimes isn't the science or the technology or the economics or the law. It's not the complexity of ecosystem management. It's the challenge of ego system management, which is that folks can think about the environment in that abstract. And going back to where you started, they can think about protecting something out there. They can also talk about protecting people out there, those people out there, and feel noble about themselves. But if you really want to make a difference, you need to actually deal with the people across the table who are making a decision or the people who are disagreeing with you and seeing if you can narrow the differences. One of the things I really like about the Environmental Justice Advocacy Committee in the community in the drinking water world is that they've sat down to meet with folks in agriculture who are on different sides of an issue and tried to understand what they're trying to do to grow food. And folks in agriculture have been open to meeting with them, and they've created this alliance that's proposed this legislation, and they proposed changes to a proposal we had put out for regulating agriculture, and we accepted that proposal because those unlikely allies actually sat down and understood where they wanted food and safe drinking water. So how would you get to it in a way that didn't just dismiss the other's talking point, but thought, is there another way we can get to it that honors what you do? And that's practicing what I think of as good ecosystem management in service to getting something done on the ground. So I guess what I would say to people thinking about going into any line of work, but particularly this line of work, is not to check their humanity and their people skills at the door when they go to graduate school or they learn a profession, because those human skills of being able to really listen to someone and not just immediately figure out how to disagree, but ask them questions about why they care about something and come up with an innovative solution that doesn't solve one problem at the expense of somebody else's legitimate interest, is a totally, it's a skill we need desperately, but B, it's the path towards action and solutions versus gridlock and stasis. I mean, there are folks who like to advocate on all sides to feel right and better than the other guy. Well, that's one level of consciousness. But really what our objective should be is to figure out how to make the world better for everybody, which requires a much more complex level of thinking. It's not simple sound bites, but also I think can involve consciousness about the nature of people and engagement, but the nature of our connection to the natural world, but to each other. And that, if you can get that anywhere in some sort of a reasonable human balance, you can be way more successful than the smartest guy in the room or the most sanctimonious guy in the room. And I mean that in a gender neutral way. And that's what we need more of if we're going to solve the problems that are coming at us with climate change. I mean, those are curveballs that linear thinking and I'm better than you, or you're good, I'm bad. I mean, you're bad, I'm good level of thinking is not going to get us where we need to go. It actually calls on all of us to up our game and our consciousness to come up with solutions that work for multiple players.
It's great. Great note to end on.
Yeah.
Felicia Marcus,
Thank you
so much for your time and for a career of really exemplary service.
Oh, thank you. I feel just honored to have had the opportunity to do these things. It's putting yourself where your mouth is scary but fantastic.
Thanks again to the Sustainable Business Partner for the California Leadership Series, LIFT. To learn more about LIFT's carbon neutral program, visit lift.com/carbon. The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music is also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please rate and review us on iTunes or your preferred platform. And be sure to tell your friends and colleagues who want to make a difference. Thanks for listening. See you next week.